So, what is Zone 2 aerobic training? Before I get into some of the details that are included on this slide here, the analogy that I like to use with most, not with most, with all endurance athletes, and then even other athletes inside of more anaerobic type sports such as football, CrossFit, weightlifting, so on and so forth. The ones that have the shorter time domains that last more along the times of seconds versus minutes, or sometimes even hours when it comes to endurance sports. But I like to use a campfire analogy. As you can see right here, I have a small campfire and I have a big campfire. And what I encourage people to think about is with the fire, think of that as the energy that you're expending. So in order, you can see with this small fire here, that fire is probably about as big as it's going to get. But you see with a bigger fire here that has bigger logs representing your aerobic system, which mainly benefits from Zone 2 aerobic training, you have an actual bigger fire. And this really comes down to metabolic pathways. You know, when you break them down in between aerobic, which means with oxygen, and anaerobic without oxygen. Well, your anaerobic pathway to funnel energy is only so big, and it comes from a finite resource of glycogen that's in the muscles and stored in the liver. And once you're out, if you're in a long endurance event, you can replace it. But generally, once you're out, you're out. And so what Zone 2 aerobic training does, it relies on fat oxidation inside of which are these logs resemble the fat cells. And you're able to build more logs and build a bigger fire, and everything gets better. So as an endurance athlete, and for all athletes for that matter, if you want to have peak performance, you need to focus on improving your VO2 max, your lactate threshold economy, and your running economy. And Zone 2 aerobic training increases all of those things. It definitely increases your VO2 max. It helps elevate when you start to produce lactate. And also, the more running you do, the more economic you get. And you can see some of these other notes on here that I talked about. You know, we need a huge fire that can burn as long as possible, utilizing those fat stores. And there is a time and place, and we'll get into it later, but, you know, high intensity is involved, but it only makes the fire burn hotter for not as long of a time. You really need those logs, the proficiency in the aerobic system, which Zone 2 training does, in order to make that fire big and burn long. And what a lot of the research concludes is that, you know, it take a long time to get big in Zone 2, and then make it as hot as possible with that lactate threshold and ventilatory threshold. And just to spend a couple quick seconds on the difference between low aerobic training, lactate threshold, and ventilatory threshold, you can think of Zone 2 aerobic training as your easy pace, easy effort, where basically if you're walking or a slow run and you're able to talk. Your lactate threshold, without getting too much into the metabolism side of things, but you can think of if you've ever been on a run or some sort of CrossFit type workout and your muscles start to get really heavy and hard to move. Well, what's happening is your body is starting to produce this thing called lactate. And what ends up happening if, once you get over that lactate threshold, it starts to accumulate and it slows your muscles down. And with your ventilatory threshold, you can think of that as when you're running as fast as you possibly can and you start breathing. And once your breathing gets out of control, so you can think of in that type of manner right there, your breathing is out of control. You have now crossed over that ventilatory threshold and you're doing everything that you can to suck in as much oxygen as possible to keep going. So as closure, just on this slide here, the Zone 2 aerobic training, what it does is as that aerobic base gets bigger, builds that bigger fire, all that other stuff elevates and you get better at all of it simultaneously.